Basically, tonight is called Technocultures, a conversation. It's with the pioneers of digital art, and it's based around the Technocultures project that Nick Lambert and Jeremy Gardner are partners in. So let me introduce our panelists first, and then we'll get started. Dr. Nick Lambert and Professor Jeremy Gardner are partners in Technocultures, a major new study of the history, underpinnings, and influences of computer art generated at Birkbeck, University of London, in partnership with the Victoria and Albert Museum and funded by Britain's prestigious Arts and Humanities Council. The project examines the development of computer art from the late 1970s to the 1990s based on the V&A's collection of artworks, publications, and ephemera assembled by Patrick Prince, an American art historian who chronicled the nascent computer art scene. We have Ken Knowlton here, and Ken is a computer graphics scientist turned artist who collaborated with artists at Bell Labs in the 1960s and the 1970s, and for the past 30 years is working mostly with his own software and creating actual and virtual computer-assisted mosaics. He's been featured in numerous books, including Al Seckel's Masters of Deception and my book, Art of the Digital Age. Margot Lovejoy is an artist and art historian, known for creating installations, books, and websites that redefine new media. She's the author of Digital Currents, Art in the Electronic Age, published by Routledge in 2004, among other books. She was a 1988 Guggenheim Fellow, and she's been featured in New York exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art, their 2002 biennial, PS1 Contemporary Art Center, and the Museum of Modern Art. In addition, her work has been exhibited in Spain at the Reina Sofia and Castellana Museums, and in Germany at the ZKM Center for Art and Media. Lillian Schwartz has created a body of work in graphics, film, video, animation, special effects, virtual reality, multimedia, and art analysis. Having successfully identified the model for Leonardo's Mona Lisa, the subject of a 500-year-old controversy, she's recently provided a new interpretation of Leonardo's Last Supper and identified the face on the Shroud of Turin. Her work spans over 4 decades and is represented in the collection of most major museums around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She's contributed to scientific research on color perception and sound, and was a consultant at AT&T Bell Research Center and Lucent Technologies Bell Innovations. She's currently a visiting scholar in the MFA Computer Art Department at SVA and is a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, and her archive resides at the Ohio State University. Kenneth Snelson is an artist with an interest in fundamental structure, as expressed in his monumental sculptures composed of metal tubes intersuspended by steel cables. Many of his large outdoor works stand in public places and museums throughout the world. He is also known for a multimedia work spanning 5 decades, Portrait of an Atom, through which he shows a new visualization of the atom's electronic architecture. Since 1987, Kenneth Snelson has used 3D computer graphics to create animations and digital images for his atom portrait. An exhibition of his sculptures can be seen at the Marlborough Gallery in Chelsea, and that's running through March 21st. So I encourage you to do that. So the way the evening will progress is that Jeremy and Nick will talk about Technocultures and what it's about and what it's studying and how it's moving forward. And then our 4 guest artists will come up and speak, and then we'll have a question and answer session and discussion. So which guy's going first? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Jeremy Gardner.
Bruce, thank you for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be in New York City. It's great to be at the School of Visual Arts this evening with our distinguished panel of guests. I'd like to begin by looking at Mohoy-Nagy. When Mohoy-Nagy was teaching at the Bauer House in the 1920s, he said, "Books are an extension of the eye, clothes an extension of the skin, and electronic circuits an extension of the human nervous system." I'm sure if he were alive today, he'd see computers as a powerful extension for the creative mind. Now, computer art has been a fringe activity since the 1950s. but I believe it's now key to artistic concerns and somehow central to our human predicament in the 21st century. Almost 30 years ago, when I was a young art student at the Royal College of Art in London, I started exploring computer image making. At that time, Tracy Kidder had written his book, The Soul of a New Machine, and I soon realized in my research that much of the groundbreaking work was being done in the United States. It was being done by artists like Ken Knowlton, Ken Snelson, Margot Lovejoy, and Lillian Schwartz. So, what I'd like to do briefly in the next 5 minutes is talk to you about my 15-year experience of computer art in the United States. It's a personal reflection on my experience while I worked in the States. And then I'd like to draw some conclusions. So, in the summer of 1984, soon after this Time magazine article was published, I traveled the United States on a Churchill Fellowship, exploring computer graphics in art education. And I got to meet a number of important artists on the East and West Coast, including John Whitney Sr. and David M. I returned to MIT in the September of 1984 to start a 2-year Harkness Fellowship in Negroponte's New Media Lab. Now, what's important about the relevance of MIT is Georgi Kepes had founded the Center of Advanced Visual Studies at MIT in 1967. He wanted to provide a setting where artists and scientists could collaborate. In 1937, he had come to Chicago to Mohoy Nage's new Bauhaus to head the Department of Light and Color. According to Kepes, art could aid science through visualization. Now, this is MIT in the 50s. Norbert Wiener at that time coined the term cybernetics, and Ivan Sutherland in 1962 developed Sketchpad as a PhD thesis, the first interactive computer graphics system. Now, the intellectual and aesthetic landscape at MIT in the mid-80s recalls Walter Pater's eloquent statement about the Italian Renaissance. He said, "Artists and philosophers do not live in isolation, but breathe a common air and catch light and heat from each other's thoughts." Having left Cambridge, I decided to move to the center of the art world, New York City. And at that time, in the 1980s, a new generation of artists were soaking in the glare of cathode ray tubes, forging new styles, defining the epoch and its ideas. Increasing numbers of artists were using computers because the prices of the hardware and software was dropping, the user interface and output technology was improving dramatically. But my experience was that there were 3 arenas of activity, each a distinct world that I would experience directly. There was the computer art world, contemporary digital artists who were utilizing computers to create a unique algorithmic aesthetic of complex visual forms. These artists were working in academic institutions and working for companies, much like my experience in Cambridge. But what's interesting at this time is that there were really only 3 showcases for this work. There was Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria. There was the New York Digital Salon, which Bruce has spearheaded over the years. And there was SIGGRAPH. Now, SIGGRAPH is vital to the project that Nick and I are developing at the Victoria and Albert Museum, because Patrick Prince was organizing the traveling art shows for that event each year. And over 15 years, she collected a vast amount of work and material about the development of computer art. That now forms the basis of one of the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Patrick also curated this exhibition, this landmark show at the Bronx Museum. She worked with Louis Cancel on the development of this project. So that was one arena. The second one was the commercial world. the commercial world of computer image making. One of my day jobs in Manhattan when I was living here was to work in video post-production in Midtown at Charlex. And I soon realized that the computer was being used as a powerful servant for the advertising industry. It was fabricating fictions which were flourishing in a culture which was relying more and more on electronic depictions. But what about the mainstream art world? How was that looking at this fringe activity, computer art? Well, the Museum of Modern Art did have an exhibition, but their focus was on the beautiful and elegant chip designs that were being produced by companies like DEC. The mainstream art world still saw computer art as a marginal event, but major artists were using computers. It was more a novelty to many of them, though. We have Andy Warhol working on his Amiga, developing portraits of Deborah Harry. Keith Haring was a graffiti artist working with a Quantel paint box. Tom Wesselman in the mid-80s was already producing his laser-cut steel reliefs of reclining news and still lives. And Frank Stella, again in the mid-80s, was using simple rotation packages to develop some of his early pillar and cone series that he then went on to develop stereolithographic forms of his cigar smoke, which we've seen in his work for many, many years. So in conclusion, my journey with computers began almost 3 decades ago. I'm a relative newcomer compared to the audience we have here this evening. But I believe today we're at a crossroads in artistic development, and the way we choose to use computers will be fundamental in determining how we evolve and move forward as artists. Now, during our debate this evening, I'm sure we're going to hear about how the computer has helped facilitate the free play of the imagination, which the philosopher Kant deemed vital to the production of art. But I think it's also important to remember that in 1985, Lisa Phillips, associate curator of the Whitney, said, "So many artists are exploring the computer that it cannot be ignored." It would be 16 years before they mounted bitstreams in 2001. So it fell to organizations like SIGGRAPH, to Ars Electronica, and to the School of Visual Arts with the New York Digital Salon to showcase this work during this time, while museums watched from the sidelines. Well, that is changing. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London has taken on the task with Birkbeck College of the University of London, with funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, to build the largest collection of computer art in the world and put this history in perspective. That job is being done by Doug Dodds of the V&A, Honor Bedard of the V&A, Dr. Nick Lambert, and myself. I'd now like to pass the mic to Nick, who's going to describe in more detail the Arts and Humanities Research Project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to Bruce for inviting us to be here today. I'm very glad to be able to expound on the scale and scope of this project, and certainly to explain something about its origins and why we've actually been able to site the project at Birkbeck and the particular interest of the Victoria and Albert Museum in this area. First, I should explain that Birkbeck College has had a long-standing interest in the history of digital art. There was a course established there by Professor Will Vaughan as early as the mid-1980s, looking at the interplay of art and digital art and art history. Following that, Charlie Gear was appointed as professor of an MA course in digital art. And in 2002, a project called the Computer Arts Contexts, Histories, Etc. project, or CASH, was actually put in place. And the purpose of CASH was to look at the history of British computer art from 1960 to 1980. As a result of that, we acquired the collection of the Computer Arts Society, which had been founded in 1969 and had actually been an international organisation based in London that acquired a lot of works from various digital artists throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. And it was crucial to being able to see the evolution of the field, to see how these artists had actually worked together and communicated their ideas at that stage. So at the moment, the Archives of Cash, the magazine they produced called Page, and a number of other archives are online at the Cash website. But also the main outcome of Cash was that the Computer Arts Society's archive was passed over to the Victoria and Albert Museum when Doug Dodds expressed an interest in starting a collection of early digital artworks, and that was in 2005. And as a result of that, and the interest generated by Cash, the collector, Patrick Prince, based in Los Angeles, based on the West Coast, and very much linked with SIGGRAPH, was approached and also expressed an interest in passing over her collection to the V&A. And thanks to a deal brokered by Doug Dodds and the American Friends of the V&A, her collection was brought over in 2006. But it left us with the slight quandary that although the collection could actually be accessioned by the V&A, it really required a much larger study to be done. And we've made several applications then to the Arts and Humanities Research Council to study the collection in depth, to understand the artists who are actually involved and represented in the collection, because of course the collection in the main was the collection assembled by SIGGRAPH for their travelling art show, of which Patrick Prince was the chair for many years. And through that collection also to understand how these artists' works have been exhibited. So the SIGGRAPH collection in the main is what makes up the body of Patrick Prince's work, but it's not just the actual artworks themselves, although we have 500 of those. We also have a large number of books, periodicals and slides. I mean, it's the documentary evidence that Patrick assembled. She was very far-sighted in interviewing artists and actually trying to find out their motivations, understanding really how they'd come to the computer and why they were actually practicing with it at that early stage. And she was also interested to gather their notes, also the catalogues from that era. So in fact, we have a snapshot really of the whole time period from the late 1970s through to about 1995. And that gives us really a very good picture of the American computer art scene, but also then the art scene throughout other international channels as well. And it's a fact of this collection that most of the works are actually works on paper. One of the central problems with collecting digital art and preserving it is in fact the ephemeral nature of the medium itself. And both trying to work with a dynamic and time-based medium, but also understanding really how to really sort of bring some of those works from their original media, the old sort of formats, floppy drives, extinct computers, other things that can't be replicated. And in many ways, the easiest way for us to do that is to concentrate on the paper archives and then to try to understand the electronic media later on. But we are interested, although most of our works are on paper, we're interested in the questions surrounding the digital medium itself. Picture of the V&A there, and also just some of the works from the collection. Also some of the archives represented there. And a picture of Patrick herself. She's surrounded by three artists who are all algorists. You've got Hans Dellinger to her left. You've got Jean-Pierre Hébert to her right, and then Roman Verostko, representing a very specific movement within computer art, the movement of the artists who use algorithms. This also is the outcome of our previous project, the Cash project, a book published by MIT about a month ago, and edited by Paul Brown, Charlie Gear, myself and Catherine Mason. And this actually collects together the reminiscences and work of 29 artists in the field and critics and historians. And so this in many ways is the summation of Cash and really also represents something of the outcomes that we hope will come from CAT as well, in terms of an edited book and understanding really the ways that the artists have been working together. And this represents something of the scope that I've been working on in my own historical study, trying to understand there, you can see it's a timeline through the 20th century. A variety of different art movements and techniques are represented by the different colours, and I know it's quite hard to see at this resolution what these are. But my take on the history and trying to understand it is that different approaches to art actually had different outcomes on the computer. Different artists came to the computer for different reasons. They found particular outcomes that they wanted to. And some of the sort of principal areas that I've looked into are abstract animation, constructivism, and also EAT and the whole art and technology movement that preceded the use of the computer as well. These are all important precedents for the way that computer art later developed. So we're trying to understand this as a holistic thing and how these different movements influence each other. Very briefly, a few works from the collection. This is one of Ben Leposki's Ocelons. Leposki, in many ways, seen as the first computer artist from around 1950. This is one of Herbert Franker's earliest works, again from the 1950s, produced using an analog computer, pre-digital. Two works here by Lillian Schwartz, including Head and, of course, with Ken Knowlton, and using the B-Flix animation system. Work by Manfred Moore and Ken Selson. And also one of Jean-Pierre Hebert's plots. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to the pioneers themselves, and I'd like to pass over to Ken Knowlton. Thank you very much.